I'm going to now move over to James on my left. And as I said earlier, James is a senior research fellow with ODI. He's an international lawyer with extensive experience with Oxfam as program coordinator for Central Africa, the Balkans, and South and East Asia. And in addition to all of the experience that comes with that, James has specialized in policy relating to the protection of civilians in armed conflict, need and impact assessment, which is one of the reasons we wanted him to speak today as a discussant, and institutional decision-making processes. And his recent work includes evaluations and strategy reviews for UN agencies and NGOs, amongst many other things. So James, you say a few words for us.
Thank you, Wendy. Yes. I'd like to say a bit about three topics, and I'll try and link it back to what we've heard from Laurie and from Richard. The first topic is the question of why we do assessments, what is the function that they perform, and I think that deserves just a little bit of reflection in this context. The second is, what are we actually doing when we do the assessments? What is it we are assessing? What does it mean to assess needs? What does it mean to assess capacities? How do we go about it? And all of those questions. And then I'd like to finish by asking a little bit about what kinds of assessments are fit for what purpose. Because your approach clearly is going to differ according to what it is you're trying to achieve. And I think we need to differentiate some different sorts of purpose within that. So I'm going to start with the question of why we do assessments, the function of assessments. Essentially what we've been talking about here, rightly, I think, is the function of that assessments play in informing decision-making processes. And I'd like to say a bit more about the kinds of decisions that are involved in these contexts and how well assessments fit with these decision-making processes. But there are at least a couple of other things, functions, I think, that assessment plays. One of them relates to slow onset crises more than it does to rapid onset. And I think for the most part what we're talking about here is the more rapid onset type of crisis. And I know that the slower onset and the protracted crisis questions are on your agenda, Laurie, and the NATF's agenda longer term. But I'd like to come back to that. So one of the functions that assessments actually perform is as a wake-up call. We haven't actually realized there's a crisis at all. And the NGOs are quite good at this. If you think of what MSF did in Niger in 2005, or I don't know, you could think of a number of examples, Save the Children in Malawi in 2002, and so on. It's just alerting us to the fact that something is going badly wrong. So in these sort of slow onset, particularly the slow onset food insecurity crises, sometimes assessments are just about galvanizing the community into action when we haven't even realized there was a decision to take. But maybe more relevant to this discussion is the accountability function that assessments play. I think one of the things that assessments do is allow us to look back and say, why did you do what you did, agency X, or you, the system? It allows us to ask, did you take a reasonably well-informed decision when you did this? And some of that's about looking at the kind of the information you had to hand. Some of it's about saying, what information did you actually seek to make a reasonably well-informed decision? Some of it is, how valid was your scenario planning? Actually, was that a reasonable set of scenarios to base your analysis on? So I do think when you look at evaluation processes, it's actually a very important part of the evaluation process to say how valid were your decisions and how well informed. And I think the way that's documented and the link between your assessment analysis and your decision making is actually very important to document, and we're not always very good at doing that, making that link. But let me come back to this question of decision making, because I think clearly the key function that we're concerned about here is the question of how assessments inform decisions of various kinds. And there are, roughly speaking, I think, I'm right in saying, two kinds of decisions here. One is the kind of initial scoping set of decisions that we try to make collectively that inform the flash appeal and the cluster analysis and so on. It's something to do with what's the nature of the crisis, how many are affected, who is in greatest need, what is our approach and what are our priorities. These are the kinds of things that are going to inform then the appeal for funds and the prioritization of funding. And for the most part, I think what we're talking about in the MIRA is a process that allows you to make pretty valid decisions of that kind, the initial scoping prioritization decision. What it can't be expected to do, I think, is to inform another kind of decision, which is the kind of program design type decision, the more detailed decision on strategy and approach and program design, which both the clusters and individual agencies need to be making. So it's one thing to try to, if you like, ensure that the resources are there in order to do what needs to be done as a priority. It's another to determine, what exactly you're going to do with those resources. And you can't expect the same assessment process to meet all of those demands. In other words, there are other assessment processes, and Richard has referred to this, going on all the time, and there need to be, and they will happen in slightly different time cycles. But it's interesting to think about the fit between this, if you like, the sort of general scoping type assessment for the sector and the individual program design assessments. And I think we need perhaps to give a little more attention to what that fit looks like. It's one thing, and I think, by the way, let me say from the get-go, I think the MIRA is a huge advance on where we've been in the past. I think this is something that really needed to happen. I think there are some remaining challenges with it, and one of the challenges is the question of what do you do when you've got all the data from the different sectors and you put it on the table? What sorts of conclusions do you draw for what a joined-up response looks like, a multi-sector response looks like? Because it's not obvious what that is. Why does it make a difference if I have information about food insecurity, water needs, nutrition, and so on? What difference would that make to my thinking about the overall response, a prioritized package of responses? Now, to some extent, I don't think there's a model for doing this. I don't think there's a formula for working this out. It's too complex for that, and it depends too much on the context. Maybe more important is the process by which you do it. It's almost, who do you need in the room with what information to make some sensible decisions about what a coherent package of interventions looks like, which is the real added value of the multi-sector dimension of this. And that, I think, is still a work in progress. I think it's fair to say. You're going to want the cluster leads in that room. But what's guiding that discussion, and how does it look better than what we've had in the past if you do this in a joined-up way? I think it should, but I think we've yet to demonstrate this. I'm going to say a couple more things about this, about the nature of the needs assessments involved. Obviously, in rapid onset crises, this is a moving target. You're doing an assessment at a certain point in time. You're trying to secure resources, often with that assessment. You're using it to unlock resources. You may be using it to design a response. By the time you've actually got down to delivering that response, you're probably 3 or 4 weeks further away in time, at least. Things move on. So what Laurie said about this not being a snapshot, one-off process is terribly important. Things change, and you've got to be flexible enough to adapt. It's not easy to do that once you've got all your funding agreements lined up and so on. So this question of the link between assessment and monitoring processes, I think, is extremely important. We have to think about how the clusters are going about their own analysis. And I think what we found when we looked at some of the early attempts to do this rapid initial needs assessment, common needs assessment, for example, in Haiti, is that the processes weren't well lined up. The clusters were going on one trajectory. The needs assessment process was happening in another. They never quite matched up so that what the rapid needs assessment process delivered was useful for the clusters. And that was a problem of design. It was also a problem of implementation. You've got to get the cogs lined up. One of the problems in Haiti, as it turned out, was that the assessment didn't deliver the information in time to inform the flash appeal, the initial flash appeal, which clearly is a problem. That was what it was for, but it didn't deliver it in time, so it wasn't as useful as it should have been. There we go. I'm going to say a couple more things and then stop when we did work on this question of needs assessment and decision making a few years ago, one of the questions we asked was, we all assume we know what we're talking about when we talk about assessing needs. You know, we know what a need looks like. Trouble is, we don't really know what a need looks like. Not least because, as Richard and Laurie have said, it will rather depend who you're asking. What do you need, for what purpose? But also, too often, what we've done in the past is essentially a process of trying to sort of measure deficits. How much of what we've got to give do you need? And we'll measure you up for it, and we'll say, right, you need this much Watson or food and so on. Not a good process. And we tried to suggest a better way of doing, thinking about measuring needs, partly using the concept of risk, thinking about what were the outcomes that of concern to you, what were the factors that were likely to lead to those outcomes, and what could you do to change those factors. And actually risk thinking and thinking about assessment as prognosis as much as about diagnosis, about projection, I think remains really fundamental to getting this right. Now, the last thing I'm going to say is, about what sorts of assessments are fit for what purpose. Mostly here, I think we're talking about the big, rapid onsets with a fairly clear beginning and a very unclear subsequent trajectory. But of course, there are other things that we have to do. Some of them I've mentioned, the slow onset disasters, but the truth is that 80% of what we spend humanitarian money on is protracted crises. It's the ones that go on year on year on year. These are the ones we could actually really bring evidence to bear on. I mean, I think it's very important to get as much good evidence as we can in the rapid onset crises, but a lot of this is about guesstimate, it's about reasonably well-informed decisions. The ones we could really bring evidence to bear on, and should do, are the protracted crises, and we don't. The assessment process is really weak. And quite often, I think, decisions that are being made about the continuation of programs year on year that are not really based on a reanalysis of the context and the role aid plays in that context, which is scandalous given how much money we're spending on it. And that, to me, it's a different agenda perhaps to the one we're talking about here. I know it's on your longer-term agenda, Laurie, but I think we shouldn't forget that there's a whole set of other questions relating to needs assessment and how we do it that we haven't yet managed to get to grips with and need to in the future.